Hello, everyone, and welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. This week, we're joined with Professor Michael McConnell of Stanford Law School. Professor McConnell was formerly a judge at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and we asked him on today for a 2022 document he wrote with a few other people called Lost Not Stolen, detailing 2020 election conspiracies, and we wanted to get his rundown on that and a few other topics of discussion for 2024, which is, as recording of this, in 10 days. But
All
first,
right.
Walter, I'll kick it off to you.
All right. Michael, how do you take your coffee, or is there some other caffeinated beverage you enjoy?
Well, I'm drinking a cup of coffee right now, and the key to great coffee is to have a milk steamer so that you can have fluffy
Ooh.
hot milk to put on top of your coffee.
Okay. So do you have an independent steamer, or is it connected to like a super automatic machine?
It's independent.
Okay. Nice. Very nice. Yeah, me and my wife, we have a Philips Seiko. They're not sponsors of this podcast. Yeah, anyways, it has an automatic steamer that she really enjoys. All right, so let's dive right in. Did Donald Trump win the 2016 election fairly without assistance by Russia?
I don't think there's any doubt about this. Uh, the the Robert Mueller team hunted as hard as they could with a whole bunch of Democratic staffers to find evidence of Russian collusion, and they didn't find anything. I think this was one of the biggest and most destructive acts of political disinformation in American history.
All right, so did Donald Trump lose the election of 2020 fairly?
I don't think there's any doubt about that either. So the Trump team looked as hard as it could for evidence of fraud. It brought something like 60 lawsuits around the country, bringing up everything that they could possibly think of, and they were all rejected. I personally looked through the records of all of those cases, and in the course of the study that Rob mentioned, the Lost Not Stolen study, and think that there's just no reason to doubt that the conclusion of our institutions that Joe Biden was properly elected under the laws in place at that time are valid. And I'd like to stress that does not necessarily mean that there couldn't have been some fraud. What this means is that the laws that were in place as of the election were properly carried out. I have no doubt we could improve our election machinery in various ways, but
Right.
it's sort of like sports. You don't judge the players according to rules you wish were in place. You judge them according to the rules that are in place prior to the game or the election.
Yeah, it's really I can relate to this back in 2000 and oh maybe 18 the Cowboys were playing the Green Bay Packers and Des Bryant made a catch and people were like it was a catch and they're like well according to the rules at the time it wasn't a catch to the rule today it was a catch, right? So I can relate with that. So how prevalent is voter fraud in any election, much less a presidential one?
So our electoral machinery has greatly improved in the last several decades, and especially since Bush v. Gore and the controversy there called attention to all of the weaknesses in our system as of that time. Remember butterfly ballots and all of that. And I lived for a very long time in Chicago, the very home of dead voters and so forth. Almost every state has improved its election machinery. And again, there are forms of fraud that I think could go undetected, but applying the rules that we have, I think the amount of fraud is relatively small. Now, almost every election, there's some people who are charged with various forms of electoral fraud. There was one very local election in North Carolina where the result was actually thrown out because of proof that one side had engaged in fraudulent conduct. So it's not that fraud is non-existent,
Right.
But when you have somebody as responsible as Attorney General Barr supervising a careful look at this question and coming to the conclusion that there was no fraud of sufficient magnitude to affect the election, uh, I think you can take that to the bank.
You and several conservatives released this pretty massive and detailed report that I've already mentioned, Lost Not Stolen. Can you lay out who's in that group, what their affiliation is, how that came together, and what also just motivated all of you to do this, to do that massive amount of work?
So the group consisted of several retired Republican appointees to the federal courts, uh, several long-standing Republican uh, lawyers, election lawyers, and I think it's fair to say Republican activists and several former Republican elected officials, like former senators. Uh, and the point of that was that we thought that people who, do not have a partisan uh, stake in these conclusions, that we might have more credibility than say, Democrats or typical members of the media.
So I want to run through several topics of that report. It was very nicely organized. I was able to read the parts that interested me. I will link that below. So if anyone wants to go and read parts that they particularly found maybe unconvincing in previous iterations or claims, you can go and find that right now. But voting deficits due to mail-in or even early voting, why did they play so much into election denial in 2020?
Well, every time there are changes in election rules, there's going to be some introduction of confusion. And 2020 was a perfect storm because of COVID. Uh, it remember how frightened people were, and there was serious talk that we wouldn't be able to conduct an election because of the dangers. And so there were hurried changes that did not necessarily get much a debate and weren't necessarily carefully thought through. There were court interventions. There were emergency actions by election officials that may or may not have complied with the state laws. So, there were, in fact, a lot of grounds for suspicion. I think that when the dust settled, it was a perfectly fair election according to the rules of the game. But it isn't surprising that under those circumstances, there would be concerns.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. So, is extending election deadlines legal in any state, and especially in Pennsylvania?
I should say, first of all, the election laws are, according to the U.S. Constitution itself, set by state legislatures with a congressional override. But this means that the law is different in every state. And the deadlines are set. Now, one of the big legal controversies in 2020 had to do with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court held that the deadline for receipt of ballots should be extended because of the crisis of COVID and so forth. Uh, there was I think, a powerful argument, a correct argument even, that was an erroneous decision. The Pennsylvania legislature that summer had debated what the deadline should be in light of the circumstances of COVID and had decided on a deadline. I think that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which is, by the way, an elected Supreme Court dominated by, as it happens, by members of the Democratic Party, I think they were wrong in extending that deadline. But we know that it didn't affect the election because the case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Pennsylvania election officials agreed to sequester the ballots that were received after the legislature's deadline and to count them separately. And there were not enough ballots received after the deadline to affect the election. As a result of that, the Supreme Court just dismissed the case because it no longer mattered. It was moot. And so we never got a real answer to the legal question, but we do know that it didn't affect the election.
Much has already been written about the Dominion voting machines, especially in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan. Were they manipulated, and can any votes in any voting machines, electronic voting machines, be manipulated through the internet?
I'd like to make it clear, I am not an expert on voting machines. I'm not an engineer. I've never looked at one. I don't know what they look like even. So all I can tell you about is about legal proceedings. And I'd like to begin with a reminder that in the 2004 election between Bush and Kerry, it was the Democrats who were claiming that the Diebold manufactured electoral counters were defective and biased. And then in 2020, it was the Republicans making the same claim about a different company's machines. These machines were in fact carefully looked at by properly appointed officials. No one has ever actually found any evidence that they were manipulable or manipulated, and the company won a libel suit against Fox News, and for a huge financial settlement because of Fox News is purveying this claim. I think we can be
$762 million, I
that's a lot of
believe.
money, at least in my neck of the woods.
I'll take that. And
So,
But you ask, could it ever happen? I'm not going to say it could never happen. What I'm going to say is that there's no evidence that it has happened.
yeah, I know very, very similar to other safeguards, like nuclear facilities are not allowed to be connected to the internet whatsoever. Voting machines are not allowed to be connected to the internet. To get its information off, you have to put flash drive in or connect it to a computer that does not have internet access available on it, period. Uh, so yeah, humans are fallible. We create fallible machines. That being said, there's already legal safeguards in place for those.
all right, what are the laws behind observing ballot processing? And even if those are inadequate, does it make the votes being counted illegal or ineligible?
So again, every state has rules about this. There's got to be a balance between the access of partisan observers and they need to be able to see. They have to be able to have close enough access to be able to evaluate, but they should not be so close that they're in the face of the election officials and engage in intimidation. There is no one right answer to that. And so the rules for that need to be set in advance and need to be followed. As long as those rules are followed, there is certainly no basis for claiming after the fact that votes are invalid because there should have been more of an opportunity for observation. Even if there are violations or mistakes made, even then, I think it's unlikely that most courts are going to invalidate ballots in the absence of evidence that there was some real fraud. If you have properly voted, to have your vote thrown out because some election official didn't understand that the distance for observers needed to be 10 feet rather than 12 feet, you would be outraged if your vote was thrown out because of somebody else's error of that sort.
Can you give us a little background by any state, maybe, or just a general philosophy of why Republicans and Democrats are allowed to have people who observe? I mean, that seems fine in like a general umbrella, like philosophical term, but also like if I was a vote counter and I see both a Republican and Democrat activist hovering over me, or even in my area, that could lead to some stress. Can you give us, I know it's a little maybe not off topic, but just it wasn't part of the questions we sent you. What can you give us reasoning for how that has permeated into law?
Well, I haven't given this deep thought, but I'm inclined to think it's a good idea to allow partisan observers, because when there is both a Republican and a Democrat observing, and they all both agree that there was no problem, that is, I think, pretty good reassurance to the public that in fact there was no problem. And if one of them does observe a problem, it then gives us the opportunity to correct the problem, before it's baked into the results. So I'm inclined to think it's a good idea. Just like in the old-fashioned in-person voting on election day system, uh, sitting there would be poll watchers from both parties, and usually it's an entirely cooperative system. I have served as a poll watcher myself, and uh, the bipartisan character of it uh, is a guarantee of integrity. I think part of our problem is that there are vast parts of the country, especially in large cities, sometimes in college towns, sometimes in some rural areas, where one party is so dominant that it's hard to have poll watchers from the other parties. And I think that's unfortunate. It would be good to have poll watchers from both parties everywhere.
You've already mentioned several times that every single state makes up their own election, not makes up, but legislates their own election laws, how votes are counted, how things are decided. Most of the country is a winner take all, but we do have two states that uh, give out their electoral votes by percentage. So that's another interesting way to do that. Is the complexity of our elections to blame in part on some of this conspiracy theories from, maybe 2004 election, 2020, 2018 in Georgia, for Stacey Abrams' run as governor? Is the complexity of our system in part to blame on people believing in election conspiracies?
Sure that the complexity gives more opportunities for raising problems necessarily. The question is whether a decentralized system is in some sense safer than a nationally controlled uniform system. I think there are good arguments both ways on that, but the fact is that the Constitution entrusts these questions to the state legislatures. Uh, that's not going to change, and so it is the system that we have.
One of the lines I give for if someone brings up conspiratorial claims on the election, it's one of the first things I say is we have such a decentralized system that it's makes it nearly impossible. The other side of the coin I like to say is the amount of government leaks we have in this country between like Tucker Carlson having unidentified aerial phenomenon videos from many decades of Navy pilots to, I mean, just all the leaks we had during the Trump administration. It makes me pretty skeptical that a conspiracy this wide would not have been flagged on some level. I mean, we have literal aviation naval pilots saying, I think that's an alien on camera, and that got leaked. If the government was really this big behemoth of a controlling state, it wouldn't allow all these leaks from the Trump administration or leaks from any administration, but along with, are aliens real?
Well, I think I'll pass on the space aliens question. That topic, I didn't take that course in law school and don't know a lot about it. Uh, but it is true that a more complicated system, which involves more people, is harder to game on a national basis. But it's probably easier to game on a very local basis. So you probably increase the dangers of manipulation of a small magnitude, but with the benefit of decreasing the dangers of manipulation that would be nationwide and catastrophic. if, for example, we had a national commission which ran elections, and that commission was appointed by the president, uh, I think that would be much more dangerous, much more suspicious. It would have much less credibility with the public than what we now have.
Yeah, that right there seems having a national commission appointed by the sitting president, that you're like, oh, that's prime for corruption, very prime. Also, in my personal view, I'm like, for there to be a national conspiracy to affect the election, I'm like, man, that's too much trust in people. That's too much faith in people's ability to pull something like that off.
And there's something I don't think we give our system enough credit. We always worry about the dangers and don't spend much time patting the Constitution on the back for its successes. So in 2020, I think it's fair to say that was the most concerted effort in American history to overturn the results of the election. So it was, in a sense, the worst ever. But look at what happened. Not a single Republican state legislature did what the Trump people were asking them to do. Uh, Not a single, the White House counsel, which are the personal lawyers of President Trump, did not go along with what they tried to end these attempts. Electors did not misbehave. Some members of Congress tried to create a problem, but they were relatively small and easily outvoted. Vice President Pence was a hero. I mean, he basically said no to improper demands. And all these judges around the country, many of them appointed by Mr. Trump, by President Trump, found against these claims. This is a system to be proud of. The 2020 election and the Trump's team's efforts to overturn the election they were a stress test. And our country passed that stress test. Our system passed that stress test with flying colors.
I'm gonna ask one more off script question. Do you think part of the reason why Trump had over 60 lawsuits is because I think he has filed over 2,200 lawsuits in his lifetime, that he has just almost gotten used to be able to bullying from a law standpoint, that you can just outpay in a way, and he just had it somewhat subconsciously in mind that if he did enough lawsuits, he would be able to get his way.
Well, I don't, possibly so. I don't understand Donald Trump's psychology, but both parties lawyer up in advance of every election. Both parties file lots of lawsuits. Just Google the names of Democratic lawyers and lawsuits after the two Bush victories in 2000 and 2004, and look at 2016. Lawsuits are part of the game. In advance of elections, both parties, recruit lawyers, they hire lawyers, and that's not going to change. It's not just Donald Trump. That's a feature of our system. But let me say this, the lawsuits are not the problem. It would be a problem if judges were bad and deciding them incorrectly, but people have a right to file lawsuits. They have a right to raise claims of problems. It may even be a good thing to have people out there with sort of hair trigger concerns about the possibility of fraud. Um, but what was so terrible about 2020 was not all the lawsuits, it was the riots and the violence. Because once you have filed your lawsuit and you have either won or lost, in our system, you accept the results. And the thing that Donald Trump did that was really different in American history is not filing lawsuits. It was his refusal to concede at a time when every bit of evidence that was available to him told him that he had lost. Compare that to Richard Nixon, who may very well have been cheated out of a victory in 1960, and instead conceded in order to spare the country the trauma of a protracted post-election battle. Or Al Gore in 2000. Both of them had much more grounds to contest the results than Donald Trump did in 2020, but both of them graciously conceded because of they thought that the national interest would be advanced by that. For Donald Trump to continue contesting the election as long as he did the country very serious disservice.
So, what are some practical ways to help people continue to trust the election process in America? I personally have seen, if you go on Facebook, everyone's going to say something, but people, even in Texas, who are saying, "I hope my vote counts toward in this election," and these are conservatives who are saying this, and it's one of those things. I'm like, wait, you're in Texas, of course your vote's going to count. Like, right, the person you're voting for is going to win Texas. So, but what are some practical ways to help people trust the process and the system?
No, I don't actually blame ordinary people for the rising distrust because let me talk about three institutions, all of whom are sowing the seeds of anxiety and distrust. First are the Republicans, who and all going all the way up to Donald Trump. He said, recently that the only way he could possibly lose is by fraud, and all kinds of Republican activists are trying to increase this distrust of the system because if they lose, they want to be able to raise the claims. But what about the Democrats? The hardly a day goes by that I don't see somebody saying that the Republicans are going to steal the election,
Right.
that and that one thing or another that and dangers to democracy. The New York Times is filled with this, which and respond some people that I think are pretty responsible individual, a former acting solicitor general, a former chief of staff for the president, a leading constitutional law scholar, and former federal judges are writing op-eds talking about how what dangers there are that the election may be stolen by the Trump side, and leads to the newspapers. They love this stuff.
Yeah.
It doesn't sell newspapers to tell people, calm down, our system is actually pretty stable. The likelihood of something going seriously wrong is not that high. That doesn't sell newspapers. And I think that, I read the New York Times every day, and it is just filled with supposed news articles about how terrible things are, how fragile things are. They are not that fragile.
It kind of sinks that voice is a reason, such as yourself. It's like how it doesn't sell news, it doesn't sell papers or whatever, and it's like, no, guys, like calm, like bring the temp down, calm down. We have a great system. Things will be
Everybody
fine.
believes that the decline of trust in American institutions is a bad thing.
Right.
That does not keep those very same people from trying to stir the pot and increase the distrust in American institutions.
What are your views of the SCOTUS presidential immunity decision, and how do you think that could impact 2024 or the 2024 election, I should say?
So the decision was not particularly well reasoned, but I think that it was inevitable that it would come out the way that it did. What people fail to realize is there has been presidential immunity, absolute presidential immunity for all official acts, that is, acts even within the exact words from the Supreme Court back, what I'm talking about 40 years ago. The words from the Supreme Court were within the outer perimeter of the president's duties, absolutely immune from civil suits. So really the only question here was whether that would also be true of criminal suits. And Jack Smith argued in the Supreme Court that criminal suits are less dangerous to the president and would than civil. And I frankly think that's completely implausible, and the Supreme Court was right to reject it. In fact, criminal suits are more dangerous. And what Mr. Smith argued, and one of the things that he argued, is that, of course, prosecutors are professionals and nonpartisan, and they wouldn't bring any criminal prosecutions against a former president that aren't justified. Well, that's ridiculous. Some of the cases, not all of them, but some of the cases against Donald Trump have been plainly partisan and wrong. We can't trust partisan prosecutors. And the other thing is, it's not as if the president is the only official who is immune. Judges are absolutely immune for their official acts. Members of Congress are absolutely immune for their official acts. Now, that's actually in the Constitution. Congressional aides are absolutely immune for their official acts. Prosecutors are absolutely immune for their official acts. Why should the President of the United States be the only major official who doesn't have immunity for their official acts? Can I say one other thing about that? You asked about the effect on this election. It's also the case that the strongest cases against Donald Trump are not based upon his official conduct. So the immunity decision has no effect, or almost no effect, on the clearest case, which is the retention of sensitive documents and the obstruction of the FBI for trying to uncover his retention of official documents. Also, most of the case based upon January 6th is about private conduct and not official conduct. So when Donald Trump calls the head of elections in Georgia, he's calling him in a capacity as a candidate. The president of the United States has no official role in conducting, counting votes or in the election. That was a private act of Mr. Trump, not an official act of President Trump. And indeed, even Mr. Smith, Jack Smith, has now refiled an indictment. And most of the original indictment is still there. He eliminated the things that he thinks are official, which had to do with instructing the Justice Department to look for fraud. Most of the rest of it is private. Now, I think there's a dispute over whether Trump's communications with Vice President Pence were private or official. Smith thinks that they were private. I think they were official, but it's not a huge part of the indictment. So the cases are going forward. That the immunity decision actually had relatively little impact on Donald Trump's personal criminal exposure.
What about that decision for a current president like Joe Biden, for a future president, whether that's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Is there something in that SCOTUS decision about immunity that concerns you at all?
I think they probably got it right. Now, let me just asterisk what right means. By right, I mean here in practicality, and also based upon precedent. It is true that the United States Constitution gives members of Congress absolute immunity for their official acts and nobody else. The right answer to all these questions might well be that nobody other than members of Congress is constitutionally entitled to immunity. That's what if you just read the Constitution, that would be the conclusion that you come to. But in 2024, when the Supreme Court is deciding the case, there's a lot of water under that dam, and I think that in the end, their decision was wise. And the biggest beneficiary is Joe Biden, because if Donald Trump is elected president, he's going to be the one invoking that decision most frequently, and rightly so.
What are your worries about, if you have any, about the 2024 election And could you give us some possible scenarios and what are the legal safeguards there?
So there are, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. Everything depends upon, what are the facts on the ground? How close is the election? If the election is as close as it looks like it might be, there will, I'm sure, be legal issues and oftentimes quite legitimate ones. Let me just throw out one where I think, there's there really are legitimate arguments. Now we have the number of mail-in ballots has vastly increased since before the 2020 election. Well, mail-in ballots present some questions. Uh, for example, many of us as we get older, our signatures change. They just look different. And when I sign my mail-in ballot, I just did it the other day, and if they compare it to my signature on the registration rolls when I registered, decades ago, is it going to look the same? What if I left off a date? Lots of people leave off the date. Uh, uh, and they have this. Well, if you go to the polling place in person, and there's any question, they can work it out right there. But if they have a mail-in ballot, there's really no way to work it out, except that some states contact voters to allow them an opportunity to cure. But does that apply to everyone? What if, Democratic areas offer voters an opportunity to cure and Republican areas don't? There's a kind of a difference in philosophy where Republicans tend to say strict letter of the law. If they didn't date it, and Democrats tend to say, well, let's count everything. There's no right answer to those questions, so there will be disputes, but they're going to be resolved in court in a proper way. After the 2020 commotion in 2022, I think it was, Congress amended the Electoral Count Act and provided for fast track procedures for electoral challenges and makes the certified results by the governor or the court in each state conclusive so that Congress will no longer be able to raise questions about electoral votes based upon the conduct of the elections. That's, of course, what the big January 6th controversy was all about. That's been changed. There now are fast track procedures for this. I don't know if every case will come out the way I would make it come out. I could tell you about the cases that have been about the election in advance, and some of them I think the courts have been right, and some of them I think the courts have been wrong. But as long as there's a full opportunity to litigate, some of the cases may be wrong, but the system, there's not going to be no perfect answer. Some of these are just, questions where there are good arguments on both sides, and let's resolve them in the proper place and not with violence in the streets.
I think for me, it's that, hey, play it out in court, see what the courts decide. And again, I go back to like toning language down. Even right, watching Stephen Colbert, I finally turned it off. I was just like, I mean, come on, guys, why are we making fun of Trump working at McDonald's? Like in my mind, I'm like, he's probably really happy right now. Like, like what person doesn't want to like have a chance to do the fry? I think it would be fun. Like, could you imagine like anyway, so
It was a good campaign stunt. Nothing wrong
it
with that.
was.
I remember when a senator worked as an Uber driver for a couple of weeks. I thought that was
Uh-huh.
great.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah.
I personally think Trump should be courting more evangelical voters by working at Chick-fil-A, but to each their own. I have one more slightly off-topic question for you, Professor McConnell. The Election Integrity Act. Can you walk us through a little bit about that, if you know or can elaborate about how that type of vote counting in Congress or how that has either restricted Congress or helped ensure election integrity at the congressional level?
Now, are you asking about the Electoral Count Act?
Yes, excuse me.
I should say, just lay my cards on the table, that I was actively involved in advising members of Congress, especially senators, about that. There was this sort of informal, unappointed group of law professors, by the way, both Republicans and Democrats, even though it was not formal, but that's the way it was, advising about that, and I think it was a triumph. It was passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities, and the best, not like dispassionate uh, experts in the country. That's my own judgment, but I think it's right. The best people in the country were listened to, and it made some important changes. First of all, it made clear that the vice president's role is to be the presiding officer. The vice president has no authority to cast out, electoral votes and declare them illegal. So the whole Mike Pence problem has been eliminated. Secondly, it raises the threshold for Congress to question electoral votes. It used to be that so long as one congressman and one senator submitted an objection, that on the day, the January 6th day of counting, that the Congress would have to go and vote separately about those objections. And by the way, it isn't just Trump. The Democratic members of Congress have challenged every election where a Republican candidate for president has won in recent memory. The Electoral Count Act amendments increases the threshold so that it now takes a third of the whole body to sign an objection before it actually will break up. Secondly, or thirdly, the act makes clear that Congress's role is limited to the legality of what the electors do after being chosen. Congress has no role in evaluating the election of the electors. That is now left to a process with accelerated, fast track procedures for judicial review. So, if an elector goes off and does something illegal, that would be the basis for a challenge. I also, by the way, think that if Congress wants to look again at the disqualification question under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, that's at least procedurally proper for Congress, but they are not going to look at the election procedures. As I remember, the leading challenge by senators, Republican senators, in 2020, or it was actually 2021, had to do with things that they thought were unfair, like Mark Zuckerberg financing election machinery, and
I'm sure those same senators will raise problems about Elon Musk doing something very similar for Donald Trump.
I
Of
wouldn't be
course, they're going.
surprised. Whoever loses, their side is going to be coming up with creative ideas. But the Electoral Count Act now makes it clear that that kind of thing is not Congress's business. So I think the Electoral Count Act went a long way toward um, uh, making it illegal or impossible to raise some of the same shenanigans that happened in 2020. Now, of course, we're always fighting the last war. So the things that happened in 2020 are now unlikely. But you mentioned space aliens. Well, the space alien involvement in the election of 2024 is unpredictable. Who knows what might happen? And we can't predict. We can't prevent things we can't predict.
Yeah, yeah. Final question for you, Professor McConnell. What are your hopes for America over the next year, over the next decade? What do you hope in an electoral fashion we can see going forward?
Well, let me say I'm pretty depressed and pessimistic about American politics right now. My hope would be that our two political parties could come back to sanity. And I believe in the two-party system, but the two-party system is based on the idea that both parties try to come up with ideas that will promote the common good, and then they'll go out to the people and explain why what they're doing will make this country a better place. Right now, our politics seems to be get people mad, get them angry, make them hate the other side, and maybe that'll drive them to the polls. But that results in a very counterproductive form of politics. And then when people are elected, uh, they're trying to get on the nightly news and to make and to say the most outlandish things in order to get the most publicity, rather than trying to look at problems, like education, like immigration, like the deficit, like our military situation, and how can we solve them? Where can we find the resources to solve them? What are we doing wrong, and how can we do it better? That's what I want our politics to be about. It shouldn't be about how, the other side are fascists or communists, and the other side is trying to, they're trying to cheat and steal. I'd like to know what's going to make life better for the American public. And I do not expect liberals and conservatives and libertarians and everything else to agree about that. We will have serious disagreements, but I want our fights to be about how to promote the public good, not how nasty other people are.
Yes, and amen to that.
Well, Professor McConnell, thank you so much for joining us on Church Coffee. I hope when this will air in a week. So if you're listening to this, it should air on November 1st, right before the election. So I hope that it is peaceful and calm, and a transfer of power will continue in the American tradition. But we'll see you next week on Church Coffee. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.